May 17th, 1943. Mid-Atlantic, 600 miles west of Ireland. Capitan Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-456, scanning the horizon through Zeiss binoculars as North Atlantic swells rolled past the submarine's gray hull. The patrol had been running for 18 days, and they had yet to sight a convoy. That alone felt wrong. May should have been hunting season, wolf packs converging on slow merchant columns, like they had in March when U-boats sank 82 Allied ships in the Atlantic. But the ocean was empty, the sky too quiet, and Hartmann's radio operator had been monitoring increasingly frantic distress calls from other boats. U-954 sunk by aircraft. U-528 depth charged by escorts. U-638 missing, presumed lost. Then Hartmann heard it. The faint drone of an aircraft engine, impossibly distant, approaching from a direction where no aircraft should exist this far from shore. He raised his glasses and saw nothing through the fog. The sound grew louder. Suddenly, his radar detector remained silent. The METOX equipment that should have screamed a warning stayed dead quiet. When the Liberator burst through the cloud layer 300 meters away, it was already too late to dive. The depth charges bracketed U-456 before Hartmann could give the order to crash dive. What the Kriegsmarine didn't yet understand was that the hunters had become the hunted, that Allied technology had evolved beyond what German submariners could detect, that 41 U-boats would die in May alone, and that the Battle of the Atlantic had just turned decisively against the wolf packs that had nearly strangled Britain into submission. This was Black May, the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. How Allied hunter-killer groups equipped with centimetric radar U-boats couldn't detect, escort carriers that closed the mid-ocean air gap, and code-breaking intelligence that anticipated every wolfpack movement, sank 41 German submarines in a single month and forced Admiral Dönitz to admit what no U-boat commander wanted to hear. The hunters had become the hunted, and the underwater war Germany had nearly won was now a death sentence for the 70% of submariners who would never return home. Chapter 1. The Wolfpack Advantage. 4 months earlier, on March 16th, 1943, Merchant Marine Second Officer William Thompson stood on the bridge of SS James Oglethorpe watching the North Atlantic horizon as convoy HX-229 steamed east toward Liverpool. The convoy consisted of 40 merchant ships arranged in 9 columns, carrying aviation fuel, tanks, food, ammunition, everything Britain needed to survive another month of war. Thompson had crossed the Atlantic 17 times since 1941, and he understood the arithmetic that governed survival in these waters. The wider the convoy, the harder for escorts to protect. The slower the ships, the more time U-boats had to position for attack. And in March 1943, there were more U-boats than ever, hunting these lanes. The first torpedo struck at 2100 hours, hitting a tanker in the port column. Within seconds, aviation fuel ignited, turning the ship into a pillar of flame visible for 20 miles. Then the wolves came. Not 1 or 2 submarines, but a coordinated pack of 38 U-boats that had been positioned across the convoy's route by orders from BDU headquarters in France. The Wolfpack tactic that Admiral Karl Dönitz had perfected relied on radio communication between U-boats and shore command. Individual submarines patrolled in long patrol lines across likely convoy routes. When one boat made contact, it shadowed the convoy while transmitting position reports. BDU headquarters then directed every available U-boat to converge on the target, creating overwhelming force against outnumbered escorts. Over the next 3 nights, HX-229 and the following convoy, SC-122, which became entangled in the same battle, lost 21 merchant ships. Thompson watched 7 of them burn or sink. The escorts, 4 destroyers, and 2 corvettes protecting 80 ships couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. When they pursued one U-boat contact, others struck from different directions. The submarines attacked primarily at night on the surface, where their low profile made radar detection difficult, and their diesel engines gave them speed equal to many escort vessels. Dönitz's tactical coordination from France meant the Wolfpack attacks came in waves, giving escorts no rest, no opportunity to reorganize defensive screens. But some convoys got through. HX-229 lost 13 ships, but delivered 27 to British ports, including tanks and aircraft that kept the war going another week. The balance was brutal, but not yet decisive. Britain needed 800,000 tons of shipping per month to maintain minimum war production and feed its population. March 1943 saw 627,000 tons sunk, approaching catastrophic levels but not quite strangling the Atlantic lifeline. The merchant sailors who survived understood they were fighting a war of attrition that could be lost without firing a shot. If U-boats sank ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them, Britain would starve, the war would end, and Germany would win without invading England. Thompson returned to New York in April and immediately signed aboard another Liberty ship for the eastbound crossing. He knew the odds. Merchant Marine casualties were proportionally higher than any American service branch except the Marines. Every voyage might end in flames, drowning in oil-slicked water, or freezing in lifeboats that drifted for weeks before rescue. But if men like Thompson stopped sailing, the convoys would stop, and stopping meant defeat. And across the Atlantic in occupied France, Admiral Dunitz studied the March results with satisfaction. His wolf packs had sunk 120 Allied ships while losing only 12 U-boats. At this exchange rate, with 240 operational U-boats now available and more, launching weekly, Dunitz believed the Battle of the Atlantic could still be won. What he didn't yet know was that March represented the high watermark of U-boat success, and that the technologies and tactics about to converge against his submarines would turn every subsequent patrol into a death sentence his crews couldn't escape. Chapter 2. The technology gap closes. While Admiral Dunitz studied victory statistics in France, Allied scientists and naval officers were deploying technologies that would render those statistics obsolete. On April 8, 1943, the escort carrier USS Bogue departed Norfolk, Virginia on her first operational patrol. She was an improvised warship, a merchant hull converted to carry 24 aircraft, barely a third the displacement of fleet carriers fighting in the Pacific. But Captain Giles Short understood what the Bogue represented. Air cover where none had existed before, closing the mid-Atlantic gap that German submariners called the Black Pit. 600 miles of ocean beyond the range of land-based Allied aircraft, where U-boats could surface, recharge batteries, and attack convoys with relative impunity. The Bogue's arrival changed the equation. Her F-4F Wildcat fighters and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers could patrol 300 miles from the carrier, detecting surfaced U-boats with airborne radar and attacking with depth, bombs before submarines could crash dive to safety. The Avengers carried something U-boats couldn't detect: centimetric tensiometer radar operating at wavelengths the German METOX warning receivers weren't designed to intercept. The older metric radar sets that U-boats had learned to detect operated at 1.5 meters wavelength. The new centimetric sets operated at 10 centimeters, a frequency range METOX equipment couldn't monitor. U-boat commanders relying on their radar detectors for survival were now blind to the aircraft hunting them. But radar was only one technological advantage converging in April 1943. Allied escort vessels now carried high-frequency direction-finding equipment, Huff Duff, that could locate U-boats by triangulating their radio transmissions. The Wolfpack tactic that had devastated March convoys relied on submarines reporting convoy positions to BDU headquarters. Every transmission now betrayed the U-boat's location to escorts equipped with HFDF. Some escort groups included specialized support groups that could pursue contacts, while convoy escorts remained with merchant ships, eliminating the choice between protecting convoys and hunting submarines. The weapons themselves had evolved. The Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar fired 24 projectiles in an oval pattern ahead of attacking ships, detonating only on contact with submarine hulls. Unlike conventional depth charges that exploded at preset depths, alerting U-boats to dive deeper or change course, Hedgehog provided no warning. A hit meant instant catastrophic damage. And depth charges themselves had improved, with increased explosive charges and patterns refined through operational experience to create kill zones submarines couldn't escape. On May 22, 1943, the convergence of these technologies achieved its first dramatic success. Lieutenant Commander William Drain, flying an Avenger from the Bogue, detected U-231 60 miles ahead of convoy, on 184 using centimetric radar. The U-boat's METOX detector remained silent. The submarine's commander had no warning until Drain's aircraft appeared overhead. Depth bombs bracketed U-231's conning tower as she crash-dived, wrecking her bridge and forcing her back to France for repairs. The next day, Lieutenant William Chamberlain followed a Huff Duff bearing to locate U-569, attacking with depth bombs that forced the submarine to surface, where escorting destroyers finished her with gunfire. The pattern was repeating across the Atlantic. Escort carriers closing the air gap, centimetric radar detecting submarines that believed they were invisible, HFDF turning every radio transmission into a death sentence, Hedgehog mortars achieving kills that conventional depth charges had missed. The technologies worked not in isolation but as an integrated system, each capability compensating for another's limitations, creating overwhelming tactical advantage that individual U-boat commanders couldn't understand because they only experienced one aspect of their defeat. But in mid-May, most U-boat captains still believed their losses were anomalous, explainable by bad luck or unusually aggressive escorts. They didn't yet understand that their METOX detectors had become obsolete, that their radio communications were guiding hunters directly to them, or that the mid-Atlantic gap they'd relied upon for sanctuary no longer existed. The technological balance had shifted decisively against them, but the full horrific realization of what that meant, that every patrol was now a probable death sentence, wouldn't become clear until the casualty reports from late May forced even Admiral Dunitz to acknowledge that his U-boats were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. Chapter 3. Convoy ONS 5. On April 29, 1943, Convoy ONS 5 departed Liverpool with 43 merchant ships bound for Halifax. Slow freighters making 7.5 knots, carrying the usual mixture of ballast and light cargo, westbound after delivering war materials to Britain. Commander Peter Gretton commanded the escort group aboard HMS Duncan, leading 6 corvettes and a destroyer in what should have been a routine crossing. But BDU headquarters had other plans. Admiral Dunitz had positioned patrol lines across ONS 5's projected route. 41 U-boats arranged to intercept and destroy the convoy in a coordinated assault that would demonstrate the Wolfpack's continued dominance. The first attacks came on the night of May 4th as weather conditions deteriorated to Force 9 gales. U-628 made contact and transmitted the convoy's position. Within hours, 29 U-boats were converging on ONS 5. The merchant ships Rena, Harperley, and West Maximus went down in quick succession, torpedoed in darkness and mountainous seas that made rescue operations nearly impossible. By dawn on May 5th, 11 merchant ships had been sunk, the kind of slaughter that had characterized March's victories. U-boat commanders reported overwhelming success. Dunitz ordered continued attacks, expecting to annihilate the remaining vessels. But Gretton's escort group and the reinforcing support groups now arriving weren't fighting by March's rules. When HMS Vidette detected U-531 on centimetric radar at 5,000 yards through dense fog on the night of May 5th or 6th, the U-boat commander had no warning his submarine had been found. The corvette closed to 700 yards before the German lookout spotted her, too late to dive clear. Vidette's depth charge pattern destroyed U-531 with all hands. Minutes later, HMS Loosestrife located U-192 by HFDF, bearing after the submarine transmitted an attack report. Radar guided the corvette through fog to drop depth charges that forced U-192 to surface, where gunfire finished her. The fog that had always favored U-boats, allowing them to attack on the surface while remaining invisible, now worked against them. Allied centimetric radar could see through conditions that blinded German lookouts, while U-boats' own METOX detectors remained silent, providing no warning of approaching escorts. HMS Sunflower detected and sank U-638. HMS Snowflake drove U-270 away with depth charge damage. HMS Pink caught U-358 on the surface and forced her under with gunfire, then held contact until relieved by another escort whose depth charges sent U-358 to the bottom. HMS Oribe sank U-125 with a perfectly placed hedgehog pattern that detonated against the submarine's pressure hull. By the morning of May 6th, when the surviving U-boats finally broke off their attacks, the tactical mathematics had shifted irreversibly. ONS 5 had lost 13 merchant ships, a grievous toll by any measure. but the escorts had sunk 6 U-boats and severely damaged 7 others, requiring them to abort to France for repairs. For the first time in the Atlantic campaign, a convoy's escorts had inflicted heavier absolute losses on attackers than the convoy had suffered. The exchange rate that had favored U-boats since 1939 had inverted. Wolfpack tactics that relied on overwhelming escorts through sheer numbers no longer worked when those escorts could detect submarines in any weather, locate them by their own radio transmissions, and kill them with weapons that gave no warning. The merchant sailors who died on 13 ships that sank in freezing North Atlantic waters had purchased proof that the new Allied technologies and tactics worked. The naval personnel on escorts that spent 7 days fighting continuous attacks with minimal sleep had demonstrated that U-boats could be systematically hunted and destroyed even during coordinated Wolfpack assaults. And the German submariners aboard 6 U-boats that never surfaced again had experienced, in their final moments, the realization that they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. Yet Admiral Dunitz, studying the casualty reports in France, refused to accept the strategic implications. His headquarters assessed ONS-5 as a tactical success. 13 merchants sunk, while attributing U-boat losses to unfortunate circumstances and aggressive escorts. Orders went out for continued Wolfpack operations against subsequent convoys. What Dunitz didn't yet understand was that ONS-5 wasn't an anomaly but a preview of what every subsequent convoy battle would become. A killing ground where U-boats died attempting attacks that no longer had any reasonable chance of success. Chapter 4. Ultra and the Code War. While U-boats and escorts fought in the mid-Atlantic, another battle was being waged 400 miles away in a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, England. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts worked around the clock, breaking German naval Enigma codes, an achievement so secret that even most Allied commanders didn't know the intelligence they received came from reading enemy communications in near real time. Commander Patrick Beasley sat in the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center in London, studying decrypted U-boat position reports that BDU headquarters had transmitted just hours earlier to coordinate Wolfpack operations. What Admiral Dunitz believed were secure encrypted orders directing his submarines into patrol lines were being read by the Allies almost as quickly as the U-boat commanders themselves received them. The Ultra program's breakthrough had come after years of mathematical and engineering effort. German naval Enigma machines used 4 rotors instead of the 3-rotor variants British cryptanalysts had initially cracked, creating exponentially more encryption combinations. But by late 1942, captured code books, brilliant mathematical analysis by Alan Turing and others at Bletchley Park, and the development of electromechanical bombs that could test millions of rotor combinations had finally broken the 4-rotor naval codes. The intelligence advantage this created was staggering. Allied routing officers could see German patrol line positions before U-boats reached them, allowing convoys to be routed around Wolfpack concentrations entirely. The intelligence had to be used carefully to avoid revealing its source. Routing changes couldn't be too obvious or too consistent. Sometimes convoys had to be allowed into danger zones to maintain the deception that Enigma remained unbroken. And intelligence alone couldn't protect convoys once U-boats made visual contact. Once a submarine reported sighting a convoy, the tactical battle still had to be fought using escorts, aircraft, and weapons. But the strategic impact was profound. In March 1943, before Bletchley Park regained consistent access to naval Enigma after a 10-day blackout, nearly every Atlantic convoy had been intercepted. By May, with Ultra intelligence flowing reliably again, many convoys crossed the Atlantic without encountering a single U-boat. Combined with HF-DF radio direction finding equipment now standard on escort vessels, the Allies had created a comprehensive signals intelligence network that turned German communications into a liability. Every time BDU headquarters transmitted patrol line coordinates, Allied intelligence located the Wolfpack. Every time a U-boat transmitted a convoy sighting report, HF-DF-equipped escorts triangulated the submarine's position and counterattacked. The Germans never realized that their supposedly unbreakable Enigma codes had been compromised, continuing to rely on radio communications that betrayed their positions and intentions. On May 12, 1943, Ultra Intelligence intercepted BDU orders positioning a Wolfpack across the projected route of convoy SC-130. The Admiralty Submarine Tracking Room, using the decrypted coordinates, routed SC-130 around the patrol line entirely while directing support groups to the area where U-boats were concentrating. The U-boats waited for a convoy that never came, while escort groups hunted submarines whose exact positions intelligence had provided. U-954 was detected and sunk with all hands, including Donitz's son, Peter. 4 other U-boats were destroyed. Not a single merchant ship was lost. The invisible warriors at Bletchley Park, mathematicians, linguists, clerks, most of them civilians, many of them women, would never receive public recognition for their work during the war. Their contribution remained classified for 30 years after VE Day, but the intelligence they provided saved thousands of merchant sailors' lives by routing convoys away from danger and saved thousands more by allowing escorts to ambush U-boats before submarines could attack. The codebreakers fought a different kind of war, one measured in decrypted messages and routing coordinates rather than depth charges and torpedoes, but their impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was as decisive as any technological innovation or tactical adaptation. Yet intelligence alone couldn't win the battle. When U-boats did locate convoys despite routing efforts, the technological and tactical superiority Allied escorts now possessed still had to prove itself in combat. The centimetric radar, escort carriers, hedgehog mortars, and improved depth charges remained essential. Ultra provided strategic advantage, but tactical victories still required destroying submarines that managed to reach attack positions. And in the final weeks of May, as U-boat losses mounted despite Donitz's continued offensive orders, it would be the combination of intelligence superiority, technological advantage, and tactical skill that would finally force the Kriegsmarine to admit defeat in the Atlantic campaign. Chapter 5. Black. May unfolds. The systematic slaughter began in the second week of May. On May 11th, convoy HX-237 steamed eastward with 43 merchant ships and an escort group reinforced by the support group from HMS Biter, one of the new escort carriers. A wolf pack of 18 U-boats positioned across the convoy's projected route waited for what should have been another March-style victory. Instead, Biter's Swordfish aircraft detected U-89 on the surface, 50 miles ahead of the convoy using centimetric radar the submarine couldn't detect. Depth bombs sent U-89 to the bottom before she could transmit a sighting report. When U-403 finally made contact and radioed the convoy's position, HF-DF-equipped escorts triangulated the transmission and counterattacked immediately. U-403 escaped damaged, but was forced to abort to France. The convoy lost 2 stragglers. The Wolfpack lost contact and dispersed. 3 days later, convoy SC-130 faced 30 U-boats, one of the largest Wolfpack concentrations Dönitz had ever assembled. Ultra Intelligence had warned of the trap, allowing routing officers to divert the convoy slightly while positioning support groups for ambush. When the U-boats reached their patrol positions, they found escorts waiting instead of merchants. HMS Loosestrife detected and sank U-209. HMS Vidette caught U-381 on the surface and destroyed her with depth charges. Aircraft from shore bases guided by Ultra Intelligence to exact U-boat positions sank U-954, killing Peter Dönitz, the admiral's son, along with U-273 and U-752. Not a single merchant ship was lost. 5 U-boats destroyed for 0 Allied casualties represented an exchange rate that made continued operations suicidal. But the orders from BDU headquarters kept coming. On May 15th, convoy on 184 was attacked by 12 U-boats. Escorts sank. U-273 and U-4556, the submarine that had narrowly survived in the intro, while driving off the rest. 1 merchant ship lost, 2 U-boats sunk. On May 19th, HX-239 faced Wolfpack attacks that resulted in 3 U-boats destroyed and 2 merchants sunk. The mathematics had become inescapable. Every convoy battle now favored the escorts. The technological advantages, centimetric radar, escort carriers, hedgehog mortars, improved depth charges, combined with ultra intelligence and HF-DF tracking, had created a killing ground where U-boats died attempting tactics that had worked just 2 months earlier. By mid-May, the U-boat force was hemorrhaging submarines faster than German shipyards could replace them. Of 240 operational U-boats at the start of May, 41 were sunk before month's end, a loss rate exceeding 17% in 30 days. Another dozen returned to port so heavily damaged they required months of repairs. The casualty rate among experienced commanders was catastrophic. U-boat crews departing on patrol knew the odds had shifted decisively against survival. Some boats never transmitted after leaving port, simply disappearing into the Atlantic with all hands. Others sent increasingly desperate messages describing aircraft attacks from directions where no aircraft should exist, radar detection without warning, and depth charge patterns of unprecedented accuracy. Allied merchant ship losses told the opposite story. May 1943 saw only 58 Allied vessels sunk, less than half March's toll, while delivered tonnage to Britain increased. The convoys were getting through. The Atlantic lifeline that had nearly been severed in March was now secure, and Admiral Dunitz, reviewing the May casualty reports at BDU headquarters, finally confronted the reality his tactical officers had been documenting. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost. On May 24, 1943, Dunitz transmitted the order his U-boat commanders had been dreading. All submarines in the North Atlantic were to withdraw from convoy routes immediately and retreat to areas southwest of the Azores where Allied air cover remained limited. The Wolfpack campaign that had nearly starved Britain into submission was over. In his private log, Dunitz wrote what he couldn't admit publicly: "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." The Hunters, submarines that had prowled the Atlantic with near impunity for 4 years, had become the Hunted, and the underwater war Germany had waged to victory was now a death sentence for crews who continued to sail. The 70% casualty rate German submariners would ultimately suffer had begun in earnest in May 1943, and nothing Dönitz could do would reverse the technological, intelligence, and tactical advantages that had turned his wolf packs from predators into prey. Chapter 6. The Submariners' War. On May 28, 1943, Oberleutnant zur See Werner Henke stood on the conning tower of U-515 as she departed Lorient, France, for what would be her 8th Atlantic patrol. Henke was one of the Kriegsmarine's most successful commanders. 23 ships sunk in previous patrols, decorated with the Knight's Cross, respected by his crew for keeping them alive through 18 months of combat. But even Henke understood what the May casualty reports meant. 41 boats had failed to return. Friends, fellow commanders, entire crews simply vanished into the Atlantic. The men descending into U-515's pressure hull knew the mathematics had turned against them. Every patrol was now a gamble where survival odds decreased with each passing month. Life aboard a Type Windsea U-boat had always been brutal. 57 men sharing a pressure cylinder 250 feet long and 20 feet wide, stinking of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the chemical smell of battery gas. No showers, limited fresh water, sleeping in shifts in bunks that never fully dried from condensation. Food rotted within weeks. The air grew foul as oxygen depleted during submerged operations. But in 1941 and 1942, submariners had endured these conditions knowing they held tactical advantage. That Allied escorts were outnumbered, their detection equipment primitive, their weapons inaccurate. By May 1943, that certainty had evaporated. The terror began with sounds U-boat crews couldn't explain. Aircraft engines approaching without METOC's warning. Radar pulses escorts used to track submarines through fog and darkness that German equipment couldn't detect. The ping of ASDIC sonar locking onto the boat's hull, followed by the mechanical clicking of depth charge release mechanisms. Then came the explosions. Pressure waves that slammed through water like hammer blows against steel, buckling frames, shattering gauges, rupturing pipes. Men screaming as lights failed, plunging compartments into darkness broken only by emergency lamps. The smell of chlorine gas from seawater reacting with battery acid. The horrifying knowledge that death could come at any depth, from any direction, without warning or escape. When depth charges detonated close, the experience transcended fear into surreal terror. The boat would lurch violently, throwing men against bulkheads. Rivets would pop, spraying jets of seawater into compartments already flooding. Cork insulation would rain down like snow. Glass faces on instruments would shatter. And through it all, the crew had to remain absolutely silent. Any noise might help ASDIC operators above maintain contact. Men stood frozen, barely breathing, while their boat was systematically destroyed around them. Some crews endured this for hours. Some boats survived by going so deep Their hulls groaned under pressure beyond design specifications, risking catastrophic implosion to evade depth charges. Others surfaced damaged and burning, crews abandoning ship into cold Atlantic water, where many drowned before escorts could rescue them. Henke's U-515 would survive her May patrol and return to France in July, one of the fortunate boats that escaped. But 37 of Henke's fellow commanders who departed in May never returned. U-954, carrying Admiral Donutz's son Peter, exploded under depth charge attack with no survivors. U-209, U-89, U-381, U-125, U-638, names that represented 57 men each, young Germans in their 20s who died in steel tubes at the bottom of the Atlantic, crushed by pressure or drowned in flooded compartments, or burned alive in diesel fires. By war's end, 785 of the 1,150 U-boats commissioned would be destroyed. Of 40,000 men who served in U-boats, 28,000 would die, a 70% casualty rate unmatched by any other military service in World War II. The submariners who died in May 1943 and the months that followed fought with courage that couldn't overcome technological and intelligence disadvantages they didn't understand. They followed orders knowing the odds had turned suicidal. They endured conditions that would break most men, in vessels that became coffins once escorts detected them. And they died, most of them, without ever knowing why the Atlantic had become a killing ground, why their METOX detectors stayed silent while aircraft found them, or why escorts appeared precisely where wolf packs had concentrated. Their bravery couldn't change the outcome. The convergence of centimetric radar, escort carriers, ultra-intelligence, AF/DF tracking, and improved weapons had shifted the tactical balance irreversibly. The wolf packs that nearly strangled Britain into submission had become hunted prey, and nothing, not courage, not training, not determination, could reverse the technological reality that made every patrol a likely death sentence for crews who had no choice but to sail. Chapter 7. The Atlantic Secured. The story of Black May revealed something deeper than a tactical victory. It exposed the fundamental shift in how modern warfare determines outcomes. In the decades after World War II, naval historians studying the Battle of the Atlantic discovered that Germany's defeat wasn't inevitable despite U-boat numerical superiority in May 1943. The Kriegsmarine fielded 240 operational submarines, more than at any previous point in the war. German shipyards were producing U-boats faster than the Allies were building escorts. Yet by late May, Dönitz had withdrawn from the North Atlantic in recognition that continuing operations amounted to systematic suicide for crews who could no longer achieve strategic objectives. The difference lay in systematic integration rather than individual capability. No single Allied technology defeated the U-boats, not centimetric radar alone, not escort carriers by themselves, not ultra-intelligence in isolation. The victory resulted from converging advantages that created overwhelming tactical superiority. Radar that U-boats couldn't detect, closing the mid-Atlantic air gap with escort carriers, breaking Enigma codes to read German movement orders, HF/DF equipment turning every radio transmission into a targeting solution, and weapons like Hedgehog that killed on first contact. Each capability compensated for others' limitations, creating a system where German submarines faced multiple simultaneous threats they couldn't counter. Industrial capacity multiplied those advantages. American shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. By 1943, Allied merchant construction exceeded losses by 3-1. British and Canadian shipyards produced corvettes, destroyers, and escort carriers in numbers that allowed dedicated hunter-killer groups to pursue contacts, while convoy escorts remained with merchants. The Allies could absorb losses that would have been catastrophic for Germany's submarine force, which lacked the industrial depth to replace boats and trained crews destroyed in May 1943. The strategic impact was decisive and permanent. Allied shipping losses dropped from 1,300 vessels in 1942 to under 650 in 1943 and approximately 300 in 1944. Britain's survival, which had seemed uncertain in March 1943 when shipping losses approached catastrophic levels, was secured. The Atlantic lifeline that carried food, fuel, and war material from North America to Britain remained open. allowing the massive buildup of forces and supplies necessary for D-Day. Without securing the Atlantic, the June 1944 invasion of Normandy would have been impossible. Germany's strategy of strangling Britain into submission through submarine warfare had failed, and nothing Dönitz attempted afterward. Acoustic torpedoes, schnorkel breathing devices, Type Wienerseen submarines could reverse that failure. Yet the victory carried staggering human cost. Over 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died in the Atlantic, men who sailed knowing every voyage might end in freezing water or burning oil. 3,000 Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy personnel died defending convoys, and 28,000 German submariners, 70% of those who served, died in steel tubes at the bottom of the ocean, fighting a war their courage couldn't win once technological and intelligence advantages shifted decisively against them. Black May proved that modern warfare rewards systematic integration over individual heroism. German U-boat crews displayed tactical skill and personal bravery equal to any fighting force in World War II. But courage alone couldn't overcome enemies who could detect submarines through fog, read their movement orders before they received them, locate them by their own radio transmissions, and destroy them with weapons that gave no warning. The lesson extended beyond the Atlantic. Victory in industrial age warfare required integrating technology, intelligence, tactics, and production into systems where individual capabilities multiplied rather than simply adding together. The submarines that prowled the Atlantic in 1941 and 1942, sinking ships with near impunity, had become by May 1943 hunted prey whose patrols were death sentences. The 70% casualty rate German submariners suffered, highest of any military service in World War II, began in earnest during Black May and never reversed. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest campaign of World War II at 2,074 days, turned decisively in May 1943 when Allied technology, intelligence, tactics, and industrial capacity converged to create advantages no amount of German determination could overcome. The wolf packs that nearly strangled Britain into submission had been defeated not by greater courage but by superior systems, and that victory made Allied triumph in Europe possible.